Thank you, Carl, and thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. Some of you will know this story well, and some of you won't. So I thought I'd start by reading a little bit from the very beginning of People Who Eat Darkness. This is from the prologue, which is called Life Before Death. And the only thing you really need to know is that Louise, who is referred to, the second girl in this description, is Louise Phillips, who was Lucie Blackman's best friend and her companion in the few weeks she lived in Tokyo. Lucie wakes up late, as usual. A line of daylight flares at the edge of the shrouded window and pierces the dim interior. A low, cramped, colourless space. There are posters and postcards on the walls, and blouses and dresses on overburdened hangers. On the floor, two human shapes on two futon mattresses. One head of blonde hair, one of brown. They sleep in t-shirts or naked beneath a single sheet, for even at night it is too hot and clammy for anything but the thinnest layer against the skin. Outside, crows are cawing and scuffling on the telegraph wires which tangle between the buildings. It was 4 a.m. when they went to sleep, and the plastic alarm clock shows that it is almost noon. The brown head remains huddled on its pillow as Lucie puts on her dressing gown and goes to the bathroom. What does Lucie see when she looks into the mirror? A full, fair face, surrounded by naturally blonde hair falling below the shoulder. A solid chin, strong, even white teeth, cheeks that lift and dimple when she smiles. A rounded nose, sharp, closely plucked brows, and small, dark blue eyes which angle away from the horizontal. Lucie deplores her slanty eyes and spends long mirror hours wishing them away. They're subtly and unexpectedly exotic on a woman otherwise so fair-complexioned, so blue-eyed and long-limbed. At 1:30, the telephone rings downstairs. It was him, Lucie tells Louise, after hanging up the pink receiver. The meeting has been postponed by an hour until 3 o'clock. He will call again, and she will meet him at the railway station. Then they will have a late lunch, but she'll be back in good time for the agreed 8 o'clock rendezvous, a night of dancing with Louise and one of the other girls from the club. Lucie takes off her dressing gown and chooses her outfit for the day. Her black dress, the silver necklace with the heart-shaped crystal pendant, and the Armani watch. Her sunglasses are in her black handbag. 3 o'clock comes and goes. At 3:20, the pink phone rings again for Lucie. He is on his way and will be at the station in 10 minutes. The crows flap and complain as Lucie steps outside. As she does, she experiences the small daily shock of re-entry, which every foreigner in Tokyo knows. A pulse-quickening awareness of the obvious. Here I am, in Japan. Every morning it takes her by surprise, the sudden consciousness of profound difference. Is it something unfamiliar about the angle of the light, or the way that sounds register in the summer air? Or is it the demeanour of the people on the street and in the cars and the trains, unobtrusive but purposeful, neat, courteous, self-contained, but intent, as if following secret orders? Even after years and decades have passed, you never get over the excitement, the unique daily thrill of living as a foreigner in Japan. The house is a grimy, plastered covered building at the dead end of an alleyway. Lucie turns right, and the neighbourhood undergoes a sudden transformation. The atmosphere up to here has been shabby and suburban. Now, less than 5 minutes from home, Lucie is walking along a main road in a big city. Railways and an expressway run above it on elevated piles. 500 yards further on is Sendagaya Station, where bus routes intersect with subway and commuter lines. It's a busy place on a Saturday afternoon, noisy with traffic and with people in short sleeves and summer dresses bustling in and out of the station and the Olympic Gymnasium on its far side. He's waiting there for Lucie in front of the police station. His car is nearby. So Lucie never returned. That was the last anyone heard of her. I'm going to skip a few pages. Her friend Louise, who was expecting to see her a few hours later, quickly became very alarmed, reported Lucie's disappearance, although no one took it very seriously at first. And a day or two afterwards, received a very, very strange and disturbing telephone call from a man who claimed, quite implausibly, that Lucie Blackman had joined a religious cult over the weekend. Louise knew Lucie well enough to realise that this couldn't possibly be true, and became even more scared. So this is the close of the prologue. Lucie Blackman was already dead. She died before I ever knew that such a person existed. In fact, it was only because she was dead or missing, which was as much as anyone knew at the time, that I took an interest in her at all. I was the correspondent for a British newspaper living in Tokyo. Lucie Blackman was a young British woman who had disappeared there, which is to say that in the terms in which I first thought of her, she was a story. At first, the story was a puzzle, which developed over time into a profound mystery. Lucie emerged as a tragic victim, and finally as a cause, the subject of vigorous, bitter contestation in a Japanese court. In its outlines, the story was familiar enough: girl missing, body found, man charged. But on inspection, it became so complicated and confusing, so fraught with bizarre terms and irrational developments, that conventional reporting of it was almost inevitably unsatisfactory, provoking more unanswered questions than it could ever quell. This quality of evasiveness, the sense in which it outstripped familiar categories of news, made the story fascinating. It was like an itch that no 4 columns of newspaper copy or 3-minute television item could ever scratch. The story infected my dreams. Even after months had passed, I found it impossible to forget Lucie Blackman. I followed the story from the beginning and through its successive stages, trying to craft something consistent and intelligible out of its kinks and knots and roughness. It took me 10 years. I'd lived in Tokyo for most of my adult life and travelled across Asia and beyond. As a reporter of natural disasters and wars, I had seen something of grief and darkness. But Lucie's story brought me into contact with aspects of human experience which I'd never glimpsed before. It was like the key to a trapdoor in a familiar room, a trapdoor concealing secrets, frightening, violent, monstrous existences to which I'd been oblivious. This new knowledge made me feel obscurely embarrassed and naive. It was as if I, the experienced reporter, had been missing something extraordinary in a city which it was my professional pride to know intimately. Within a few weeks of her disappearance, many people had heard the name Lucie Blackman and knew her face, or at least the version of it that appeared in the newspapers and on television, the Alice in Wonderland face of the girl in the missing person poster. To them she was a victim, almost the symbol of a certain kind of victimhood, the young woman who comes to a ghastly end in an exotic land. So I hoped that I could do some service to Lucie Blackman, or to her memory, by restoring her status as a normal person, a woman complex and lovable in her ordinariness, with a life before death. So that was the 1st of July 2000, more than 11 years ago, and for much of that 11 years I've been thinking and writing about this story. So the obvious first question is why? What makes any story worth putting in all that time? And perhaps I can best explain that by giving a potted summary of this case and trying to show how over the years it shifted and changed and mutated, so that by the end, instead of writing just one theme about just one theme, I found myself dealing with several different, to me, very fascinating and rather diverse subjects tied together by this tortuous, very unpredictable and frequently bizarre sequence of events which made up this story in its entirety. And at the end it also, as Kyle alluded to, became rather personal, and I'll come to that too. Anyway, it began in July 2000 as a mystery. What had happened to this girl, Lucie Blackman? She'd gone out one afternoon to meet a customer from the club where she worked as a hostess and had never come back. According to her family and her friends, she was a decent, reliable kind of girl, not the type who would just wander off without telling anyone. So where was she? Nobody knew. Her father and her sister, Tim and Sophie Blackman, quickly came out to Tokyo to look for her. There was a police investigation. 30,000 missing person posters were put up, and the story was covered in newspapers and on TV in Japan as well as in Britain. But the weeks passed and there was nothing, no word from Lucie, no sightings, no trace of anything. And it became clear that something nasty had happened, but what it was no one could say. So a mystery story, a story that was itself a question: what had happened to this girl? Into this void of any kind of information, all kinds of unusual and unlikely people were sucked, offering help of various kinds. So there was a team of volunteers who offered their help and assistance to the Glatman family. They set up a kind of office in Roppongi, which someone lent them, and did what they could to find out what had happened to their daughter. Many of these were very sincere and well-meaning people, although by the end of the story, this team had ended up very sadly and rather bitterly divided. There was also a cast of mediums and spiritualists and dowsers, the kind of people who are often attracted to cases like this one, where someone's gone missing. And there were also much more dramatic red herrings on the way. One day, a man who identified himself as an arms dealer came to see Tim Blackman, the father, and explained to him that Lucie had been kidnapped by the Yakuza, and that in return for £20,000 he could help to find her and get her released. And another time, in their little office in Roppongi, a very neat, polite, unassuming man, Japanese man, called on Tim Blackman and explained that he was a sadomasochist, and that he believed Lucie had been kidnapped by some sadomasochistic chums of his who were planning to make a snuff film. And this information led to some of Tim's volunteer helpers breaking into an S&M dungeon in Yokohama on the strength of that tip-off. The arms dealer was a con man, and the S&M people had nothing to do with the case. But quite early on, as this information was coming out, it became obvious to me that even the time wasters and the con men in this case were fascinating. It was like looking for something and lifting up a big, mossy old rock and finding underneath it not the thing you're looking for, but all kinds of strange and unexpected insects scuttling away in all directions. But as journalists, we were faced with a problem of how to report this. And early on, a lot of tabloid reporters and TV crews flew out from London because for the British media it was clearly a story with obvious news value. A young, attractive British woman missing in a little-known place. But the question was how to report it. The family wanted to help, they were desperate, but they knew really almost nothing. And the police weren't much help at that stage. So, as good journalists, we did the only thing which we could think of, which was to go out on expenses, night after night, to girly bars in Roppongi. This is a very dignified place of scholarship and learning, so I'm sure that no one in this room has ever been to Roppongi. Am I wrong? Has anyone have you been? Possibly during the day to buy stationery or something like that. If you haven't been, it's a fascinating place. It really is. It's unique in Japan, unique in Asia. Lucie Blackman was working as a hostess in a Roppongi nightclub. So one of the first questions asked by editors and readers back home was, what did that mean? What did hostesses really do? And what was this place, Roppongi? The shorthand that a lot of journalists use was to describe it as Tokyo's red light district. But to anyone who's been there, you know that that's an inadequate and rather misleading description. It's understandable why people, foreigners, I think, groped to understand what Roppongi was about, because I think if you met someone in London or New York who described themselves as a bar hostess, you would probably assume that they worked in the sex business or some branch of it. Hostess in English sounds dismally seedy, but in Japan it means something else, something far more ambiguous and complicated. It's a facet of the old Japanese milieu, the mizushobai, the water trade, the nightlife world of drinking and pleasure, and sometimes, but not always, sex. And there are hostesses, including foreign hostesses, who have sex with customers in return for cash. But there really are not many for whom it's so simple as straightforward as that. And there are a much larger number who do no more really than pour drinks, light cigarettes, and occasionally fend off a wandering hand. The problem is that between those two extremes, between outright prostitution and being a flirty barmaid, there's a grey area. And once you're in at the cigarette lighting, drink pouring end, it's really not a very long way to the prostitution end. There isn't a great leap required between the two, and if you're young and pretty, then you will quite quickly and unexpectedly find yourself in a position where, whether or not you're interested, you are at least being offered the chance to become a high-class prostitute of a kind. So this was also very interesting, and I spent quite a few pages in this book discussing and looking into Roppongi and the water trade and the world of hostesses and what they all mean. And another institution which this story brought me into contact with, which I write about in the book, was the Japanese police, as Carl mentioned. The Japanese police are hard work, certainly if you're a foreign journalist. Towards the end of my research, after long efforts, I did succeed in talking to 3 or 4 police officers involved with the case, and I discovered something that I find very often with Japanese organisations, especially difficult Japanese organisations. Individually, these officers were charming men, dedicated, hard-working, individually kind, decent, very sincere. But as an institution, the Japanese police were shown up and to some extent shamed by this case. It wasn't just the amount of time it took to solve the case and to bring charges, because it was a very, very difficult, very unusual case. The scandal really was that the man who was eventually convicted, Giorgio Barra, wasn't charged with any crime until 2000-2001. According to the prosecutors, he'd been drugging and raping women for decades, and some of them had gone to the police. They'd barely been given the time of day. The police certainly didn't investigate seriously until it became a case so big that they couldn't ignore it. But eventually, in October 2001, so 3 months after her disappearance, the police arrested a suspect. And in February the following year, they recovered Lucie Blackman's body, which had been chopped up and buried in a seaside cave close to a property owned by Giorgio Barra. And by April, he was on trial for 8 charges of rape and 2 of rape and killing. One of Lucie Blackman and also an Australian hostess, Carita Ridgway, who died in 1992. And that might have been the end of the story, because, as many of you know, in Japan, more than 99% of criminal cases which come to trial end in conviction. People don't really get off. And although, of course, technically suspects are innocent until declared guilty at the end of a trial, for practical purposes, it's over once the charges are laid. But this was not a usual case, and these are the next elements in this story which made it so fascinating. The trial, and also the suspect, this character, Giorgio Barra. Giorgio Barra is a very remarkable person, and difficult to do justice in a few sentences. I spent a lot of time looking into him and his past, and of all the mysteries associated with this story, his is the greatest. What made him into the person he is, and what formed his extraordinary predatory psychology. It was very tempting in writing this book to pretend to more than I really knew on that. These days, I think we're all amateur psychiatrists, and there are plenty of things in Giorgio Barra's background which, on the face of it, you could point to if you were looking for an explanation of how he became abnormal. He was born in Osaka as the child of first-generation Korean immigrants. His father came to Japan poor as an immigrant and became rich very quickly after the Second World War, principally in taxis, property and pachinko parlours in Osaka. The father then died in rather murky circumstances in Hong Kong when Obara was a teenager, leaving a fortune to his 3 very young sons, or rather 4 sons. And alone among his family, Giorgio Barra was the one who changed his nationality from South Korean to Japanese, also changed his name from Kim to Obara, and even changed his face. He had the eye operation, which turns the Asian, the Mongoloid single fold of the eye to the larger double fold. So already there you can see problems, issues in his life relating to identity, racial, national, economic identity, and great disjunctions and changes in his life and in his family when he was still very young. He went from being Korean to Japanese, from poor to rich. He changed his eyes. He used dozens of aliases. As a sexual predator, he used different names with almost all the girls he encountered as part of his modus operandi. But none of this really explains what he did. At least plenty of other people had some or many of those experiences, some of that background, and only he became the Giorgio Barra. He was eventually convicted of 9 rapes and 1 attempted rape, and although he wasn't charged for more than that, the police uncovered from his properties videos. He made videos of his rapes and notebooks which suggested he had many more victims than that. So he was a very wealthy sexual predator who seems to have gone through life with very few friends or close associates of any kind. At least I couldn't find them. But he's a man of extraordinary determination, and aided by his great wealth and the many lawyers which that allowed him to hire, he fought vigorously for his own acquittal. And on the face of it, the evidence against him was overwhelming. I won't go over it all, it's all in here. But to give you an idea, he videoed himself in the act of raping many of his victims after he drugged them, and the prosecutors found this home video library. In the days after Lucie Blackman's disappearance, for example, they found his hard drive on his computer, and he performed a number of searches for search terms such as buying sulfuric acid and how to dispose of a dead body, which raises suspicion at the very least. They also found receipts for the shopping trips he'd been on over that same period, those few days, when he bought, among other things, a chainsaw, an axe and a shovel. And they also eventually found Lucie Blackman's remains, which had been cut up with the same model of chainsaw, although they never found the actual saw, and had been buried in a cave 200 yards from one of his properties. The problem was that the evidence was circumstantial. There wasn't a video of Lucie Blackman with Obara, and there was no direct evidence linking Lucie's remains to him. There was no DNA evidence. And he was able to exploit this in a bizarre trial, which often seemed to be getting out of the control of the judges. I mean, Japanese criminal trials, they've got a lot quicker now because of the new lay judge system, but back then they would last a few weeks or a few months at most. Obara's trial lasted for 62 separate hearings over 6.5 years. And at the end of it, he got a life sentence for the 8 rapes and the 1 rape killing, but he was acquitted of everything connected with Lucie Blackman. On appeal, the prosecutors appealed, and most but not all of those acquittals were overturned. So at the end of it, he was convicted of abducting Lucie Blackman, drugging her, attempting to rape her, disposing of her body, but not of killing her. So the whole story was extraordinary. It had so much to it. It was a mystery which became a tragedy. It was a police detective story. It was set in this interesting corner of Tokyo, in this murky world, of this morally grey world of hostesses. And there was this extraordinary villain and this protracted courtroom drama. And I knew with these ingredients that it had the makings of a good book, and I sold the idea to a publisher and began working on it. And it was only after I was a good way into the research that I identified 2 more elements which I hadn't expected would become such a big part of the story. And the first of these was Lucie Blackman's family. And one of the first things I did after deciding to go ahead with the book was to visit both of Lucie Blackman's parents, Tim and Jane, who I had met several times when I was reporting it for the newspaper. And I talked to them about what I had in mind. And I knew very well, and it was no secret, that they'd been through a very bitter divorce before Lucie had even thought of going to Japan. So I went to see them and told them what I had in mind for this book. And I said to both of them, and it was perfectly true at the time, that I wasn't interested in their marriage and what went wrong, and certainly not interested in adjudicating right or wrong between them. This will be a book about what happened to Lucie, not to them. As it turned out, that by the end that was not true. The relationship between Lucie's parents became a very public part of the story in 2006, when, to cut a long story short, Tim Glatman, Lucie's father, accepted 100 million yen from Obara, who was then going through his trial, as so-called condolence money, mimaikin. And this enraged his ex-wife, Lucie's mother, and angered many other people associated with the case. And it became obvious then that I couldn't ignore this relationship between Tim and Jane, because as well as a lot of other things, this turned out to be a story about a family. The way they responded to her disappearance, which was very unusual, the way they dealt with her death, and the effect of those events on her. And it is also about the way that we in society at large deal with victims. and the forms in which people's compassion takes, the rather narrow-minded forms it takes, and the ways in which we actually expect bereaved families to behave. But the last element, and the element which took me most by surprise, was Lucie Blackman herself. When I started out on this, without having thought about it very hard, I think I assumed that she wasn't very interesting, or wasn't a very important part of the story, in fact. I mean, of course she was the victim, the rather passive catalyst of everything that followed. But I didn't at first think she was very interesting in herself. She was 21, very young. She was a decent girl from a middle-class family, average education, accomplishments, ambitions, and so on. But she wasn't someone I felt that I had very much in common with, or much interest in. But then I began to talk to her family and friends introduced me to friends. And I realised something that we all really know from our own lives, which is that even at the age of 21, she was a complicated, mysterious and unique person. And all her friends, and even her family, the people who knew her best, described someone subtly different. And it was very interesting to spot those differences and to build up a picture of this person who I'd never met, never could meet. And in some ways it was a lesson in humility too, and in not making assumptions about people you don't know. Then, quite close towards the end, when I was well into researching the story from a detached position as a journalist and observer, the story stood up and tapped me on the shoulder, as it were. Strange things started happening, which are a bit difficult to summarise concisely. Partly for legal reasons, I have to be careful about what I say. But someone hired a private detective to follow me and to take covert photographs of me as I was going about my rather eventful life in Tokyo. And this person also wrote to assorted ultra-nationalists, explaining in a lot of detail that I was an enemy to Japan, and especially an enemy of the Japanese imperial family, who I was trying to cause the downfall of, and encouraging these right-wing nutters to take unspecified but clearly punitive action against me. So I was advised by the police to take these threats seriously, and for a while the police kept an eye on me. And twice a handful of really rather decrepit uyoku, ultra-nationalists, turned up outside my office and blared less than friendly slogans and drove around in their black truck. And who was all behind all this? I don't know, and I really can't say, but I have my suspicions, let me put it that way. And around this time too, I got a very official-looking letter one morning informing me that Giorgio Barra was suing me for libel. He was demanding 30 million yen from me personally, not from my newspaper, which would be the more conventional object of a suit like that. And I was summoned to appear in court. And it's a funny thing, which other people have since told me it's quite common, but I don't know if any of you have ever been summoned to court, but the first thing a lot of people think of when you get a summons is, I must have done something terrible because I've been summoned to court. In fact, I hadn't done anything terrible at all, and the complaints he made against me were both very feeble and extremely bizarre. And luckily my employer, the Times, unhesitatingly covered all the legal costs. So what began rather alarmingly developed into actually a rather gift for someone who is writing a book about Giorgio Barra and about courts. And in due course the libel complaint was thrown out, appealed and thrown out again. So all was well, that ended well. I think I'll leave it there, but if we've got a little more time, I'll just end with another reading from a bit later on in the book. These are events in February 2001, when the police, who'd apparently been looking for Lucie Blackman's remains for weeks and failed to find anything, resumed their search. Winter in Japan is bright and bitter, but the cold keeps the vipers at bay. As he told it, this was when Superintendent Udo made a last attempt to find Lucie in the places known to have been frequented by Giorgio Barra. It's a vast area, he said, and there are many places where a body might be buried. I formed a team and told them to go out and not come back until they had found Lucie. In December and January they dug in many places. One Monday, early in February 2001, 22 plainclothes policemen checked into an inn on the beach in the village of Moroiso, a few hundred yards from Obara's apartment. Their rooms were reserved for the whole month. Every morning they went out with shovels and picks to different spots along the coast. The local people assumed they were employed on some municipal project or other, except that, as one local woman said, they didn't have the eyes of construction workers. On Thursday, the 8th of February, Udo sent his deputy down from Tokyo for consultations. It was concluded that the search area had been expanded too far, and that the following morning they should begin again in the most obvious place of all, the 250 yards of beach which extended beneath a cliff next to Obara's apartment. It was there, 5 days after Lucie's disappearance, that Obara had arrived in a car with lumpy objects in the passenger seat. There, he had summoned a locksmith to break into his own flat, from which banging noises had subsequently been heard. There, a sweating, shirtless Obara had first dismissed the police who had knocked on his door, and later apologised to them, proffering the frozen corpse of his dead dog. Sorry, that's such a rush of bizarre facts. It's sort of explained in more detail earlier on. Mr. Hirokawa, the caretaker's boyfriend, even claimed to have seen someone resembling Obara in the area of the beach in the middle of the night, carrying a muddy shovel. Police dogs and police officers, of course, had sniffed and prodded the area after Obara's arrest in October. But now, in desperation, they were to go over it again. The oblong block of Obara's apartment was the last structure before the road ended and the seashore began. It was a rocky coast. The cliff fell vertically to a beach strewn with large boulders, over which a cement path had been fashioned. It wasn't a charming or attractive beach. The sky was high and blue at this time of year, and the water was so clean and clear that you could see the forms of individual stones along the bottom. But the sand on the beach was grey and sticky, and the boulders were littered with dried and broken leaves. In the summer months, they shimmered with thousands of vile brown beetles which sucked on the seaweed rotting in the cracks of the rocks. Around a curve of the beach, about 200 yards from the apartment building and out of sight of human habitation, a portion of the cliff had tumbled away to form a tower of stone embedded in the beach. Just behind here, and concealed from view by it, was a cave. It was the kind of hideaway where rubbish is surreptitiously dumped and where teenagers go to smoke and canoodle. In a country less tidy and disciplined than Japan, it would have been littered with beer cans and discarded condoms. It scarcely qualified as a cave at all, more of a wide crevice in the dirty rock, 8 feet wide at its mouth, 10 feet high at its highest point, with walls and ceiling which narrowed and sloped to a dead end. 4 crumbling plastic pipes protruded from its uneven ceiling and dripped onto the floor, an ancient attempt to channel rainwater from the cliffs above. An old bathtub was partially submerged in the sand. At 9 a.m, 4 of the policemen loosened it, hauled it out of the cave, and began to dig. Within a few moments, they encountered an obstacle which rustled against their spades. Tugged out of the sand, it emerged as a semi-transparent plastic rubbish bag containing 3 lumpy objects. They were immediately identifiable as a human arm severed at the shoulder and 2 human feet. The wrist was entangled with plants and seaweed. The flesh was white and waxy with decay, but the finger and toenails were preserved, and the men with the spades observed how neat and well-shaped they were, with traces of nail polish. The officer in charge called Udo once on his mobile phone. He was shedding tears to me as he spoke, Udo remembered. He said, "Boss, we found Lucie." I'll finish there. Thank you.
So don't be shy. If you could raise your hand if you have any questions. Speak up. Jeff?
Richard, early on you mentioned the failings of the police and the number of women who have been victims of Obara had gone to the police and complained, but they didn't follow up on those complaints. I wonder if you could talk about that a bit. And also, Obara, was in detention for quite a while, rearrested 6 times. You mentioned the high rate of conviction in Japanese courts, which is based on confessions. Why did the police have no success in getting Obara to confess?
Yeah, good questions. Your first question was so good, it's completely gone from my mind. Remind me what it was.
The question is about, a number of young women had
Yes, oh yeah, okay.
and they didn't follow up, and so why
Yes.
was that, and what does that tell us about his method?
Yes, there were. Now, I identified 2, and I corresponded in detail with one former hostess who woke up from this date rape drug, which Obara used. Very, very groggy. She knew immediately what had happened. She could guess. She was in a guy's bed, couldn't remember what had happened. 12 hours had passed, which she couldn't account for. And she went to the police more than once. I think twice when it happened, and then once again soon after Lucie disappeared. And on the 3 occasions, she really wasn't taken seriously. I think the reason was that she was a hostess, and that there seems to have been, and possibly still is, a sense among a lot of the police in Roppongi that hostesses are really not to be trusted, that girls in that business who end up having sex with customers can't expect anyone to take very seriously their complaints. No policeman has ever said that to me, but that's what I surmise. The second question about confession, another remarkable feature of the Japanese criminal justice system is just how many people confess. It's staggering if you compare it to other kind of Western jurisdictions, and there are several reasons for that. Japanese police explain that essentially Japanese people are quite honest, and when confronted with the truth, they generally own up. And it sounds rather feeble, but I think there may be something in that. They also have 23 days of continuous detention with which to question someone before charges have to be laid. Far more than, certainly in the UK, where you get, I think, 48 hours at most. That's a long time. I mean, they don't have to let you see your family, your lawyer. They can just throw away the key and let you sit there. That's more than 3 weeks of being on your own. So there's a lot of pressure. they very rarely, I think, use violent or coercive methods. I think at most, there's a bit of shouting and blowing cigarette smoke in the face. They don't need to because they have this long period to bang people up. And why didn't Obara confess? Because he's a remarkable person. I mean, a man of extraordinary determination. He would be extraordinary anywhere in the world, and in Japan he really is amazing. Where it comes from, I really don't know. I don't think I honestly got to the bottom of that question. Although there are hints here and there in his background and in his past.
Thank you for your question. Thank you for your lecture. I have two questions I'd like to ask you. I remember this case when it happened. I was about 15 at the time, so I guess I overlooked Lucie Blackman now. But I want to know: were you surprised when you heard a verdict that Obara didn't get a death penalty, despite all charges he got? And second of all, what was the did you get I think you the one who wrote the Obara was a former Korean national who who changed his nationality to Japanese. In Japanese media, I don't think I ever heard that report, and you're the first one I heard. So I was wondering, did you get any kind of criticism or some sort of hate mail or hate call from Chosen Soren or the Mindan, those Korean groups, activist groups in Japan?
Yeah, I wasn't at all surprised that he didn't get a death sentence because the prosecutors never charged him with murder. The crime with which he was charged was, it's clumsy to translate it into English, but it's something like rape resulting in death, or rape and death as a consequence. It's the equivalent of kind of manslaughter, you'd say, in British law. Illegal homicide, but not murder. If they charged him with murder, of course, then a death sentence would have been a possibility. But they made a decision not to charge him with murder because I think they realised that there was a shakiness about the evidence. They didn't have a confession, and they didn't have the conclusive proof linking Obara to the body, to the remains. What I was surprised by was that he wasn't convicted even of that. I mean, at the first trial in the Tokyo District Court, he was acquitted of everything relating to Lucie. He got a life sentence because he was convicted of killing the other girl, the Australian girl, in '92. That took me, and I think everyone who'd followed the case closely, by surprise. Obara's legal tactics worked. He managed to sow in the minds of those judges sufficient doubt. Now, it was overthrown on appeal, largely. As I said, he was acquitted of just this one thing. He was convicted of everything except killing her. And the judge explained in his ruling that was not because he thought Giorgio Barra was innocent, but because the evidence was not adequate. So by the end, that was less surprising. On the matter of his Korean nationality, it's a very interesting question. The Japanese media, it was reported, I think, in Shukanchi, weekly magazines, that his family was of Korean origins. But I don't think any mainstream media ever referred to that. And as you know, there's I think it is right to call it a taboo about mentioning Korean ethnicity in the Japanese media. I think the reasons behind it are complicated, but people don't want to be criticised for seeming to imply that criminality is related to ethnicity, right? And you have to be very clear and state this clearly. It's not. There is absolutely no connection between anyone's race and their criminal tendencies, in my view. Having said that, there is a lot of nasty stuff on the internet, if you search in Japanese, which alleges that Obara's criminality is somehow a consequence of his Koreanness. I think that's racist poison, and it's not true at all. I have, reported this where it was relevant from the beginning, and no, I never had any criticism. Japanese colleagues, journalists, would sometimes, express, I suppose, surprise that it was something that I felt I could report freely. But I never hesitated where it seemed to be an important part of the story. I mean, you wouldn't mention it in a short news report, but in a longer feature about Giorgio Barra and his past, I think it's important and interesting.
Thank you. Because just one more thing. Because when you said you had a lot of so-called right-wing nuts, speaker wagon surrounding your office, and you may know a lot of those so-called claimed Japanese nationalists are not Japanese nationals.
Now, these guys were Japanese, I'm pretty sure, and that was a different thing. No, they were put up to it by someone I can't identify. I've no idea who it was. It was very odd. Chap there.
Yeah, maybe the same question that you implied that person is not neutral, right, but kind of yakuza, or the person pretend to be yakuza. There.
Well, I'll tell you what happened. It's quite a long story, but since there are 2 questions on it, I was at home one day, and my partner rang, and she said, "We've got this very weird delivery envelope. You should come back and have a look." And I went back, and it was a big, heavy envelope. I tipped it out, and there was a book and several printed pages and photocopies of my business card and a sheet of colour photocopies of photographs. And I could tell immediately from looking at the photographs that these were photographs of me, sometimes with members of my family, friends, which had been taken covertly by someone who'd been following me. I mean, I could see where I was, I remember where I was on that day, but I certainly hadn't been aware of the guy with the camera. So someone had been following me and taking photographs. So I had my assistant examine these Japanese documents, and it was a very bizarre document. It was from an unnamed comrade, I think he described himself, and it was addressed to a right-wing group in Tokyo. The reason it had ended up in my letterbox was that he'd got the address wrong. The post office had opened it, and all they could find in by way of an address was my business card. So it was sent to me by accident. I was the last person who was supposed to ever see it. So this long document appealed to the patriots of Japan to do something about this Richard Lloyd Parry chap. One rather amusing thing it said that he describes himself as a bureau chief, which of course is quite a grand title in Japanese, although only 2 other people work in his office. It's true. So maybe I do have ideas above my station, but everything else in it was bizarre. I mean, the book which it contained was the translation of a book by the translation into Japanese of a book by an Australian journalist about Princess Masako, which came out a few years ago and caused a bit of a flap here. It was regarded as very disrespectful. And this journalist had interviewed me, and I was quoted a couple of times in that book, saying not particularly controversial things. So this has been highlighted in the book, and these separate notes explain that I was an enemy of Japan, dedicated to bringing down the Japanese state, especially the royal family. It mentioned that during the war, members of the Lloyd Parry clan killed 103 Japanese soldiers somewhere, which is certainly family history that I've never come across. and it called upon the recipient of this letter to deal with me, to kind of mete out unspecified punishment. So he took it to the police. I thought it was a bit of a joke, but they took it rather seriously and gave me alarming advice, such as when you're taking the subway, don't stand too close to the edge. Stand well back, and when you're crossing a road, do the same. They checked it for fingerprints. Nothing came up, at least no fingerprints they had on record. And they sort of kept an eye on the house for a while. Nothing happened, and then one day out of the blue, I got a phone call from the police at the police station local to my office, saying that the Uyoku have made an appointment to carry out a demonstration at your office. Very considerately, they inform the police before they go and denounce anti-Japanese elements. So it was obvious what had happened, that this one letter I'd received had been one of a large number of mail shots which had been sent out to a number of addresses in the hope that someone could be encouraged by proxy to have a go at me. Now, in the end, the worst that happened is that they drove around the office a couple of times, blaring out slogans in the way that they do in the embassies near here. That was all it came to. So that, you can see how complicated the story it is. That's the story of what happened. No, they weren't. I don't think they were Yakuza. They were Japanese. They were a group of rather elderly right-wing zealots from Saitama. Not there's anything wrong with Saitama.
Hello. Is this on? Hello. Okay, never mind. I just wanted to ask a couple of questions considering the victims of Obara. Slip. You said that you mentioned to the other chap over there that Obara he was still continuing to rape girls after he had killed Lucie Blackman. You said that there was someone who went to the police after the police, she went to the police after Lucie Blackman had been murdered. And I just wanted to ask you, do you think that maybe one of the reasons why they didn't take it seriously is because maybe she was because they're foreign? Or?
No, the sequence of events was. Shall I answer that one first?
Yeah.
And then, as far as I know, he didn't victimise anyone after Lucie Blackman's disappearance. She was the particular woman I'm thinking about. There was more than one. Was raped by him before that, a few years before. She went to the police after it had happened twice. They showed no interest. After Lucie Blackman went missing, she immediately knew, or she believed she knew, it was the same person. She thought it sounded very likely anyway. And she went to the police then, and at first they weren't interested. And then a few weeks later, as the case became possible to ignore and they learned more, they became very interested indeed, and they came back to her.
I just wanted to ask also, did Obara, he victimise just foreign hostesses? Because I don't think it was ever mentioned that, from what I recall from reading the case, that there was any Japanese hostesses.
No, a lot of Japanese. In fact, of the 8 rapes he was charged with, the women who survived, 4 of them were Japanese and 4 foreign. He used to. The foreign women were mainly hostesses. With the Japanese, he often picked them up through that system they used to have. I don't know if they still do, called dengon diaru, which is kind of telephone contact. Yeah.
Hi Richard, thank you for that switch. I read Jake Adelstein's Tokyo Vice first, and read this Lucie Blackman story, which is how I kind of got onto your book. But when I read the Tokyo Vice book, it seemed to do a pretty soft treatment on Tim Blackman. That there was sort of a discussion that he was, not well liked, didn't really understand the background. But when I read your book, I thought the most fascinating character of the whole book was probably Tim Blackman. He was the only person that was live and was interacting with you in such a manner that it felt that the guy was, well, towards the end of it, I felt that he was evil, like as even a father. I was just wondering, when you interviewed him and when you met him first, when he first came to Tokyo, when he was conducting those press conferences, and then you did all those interviews afterwards, whether your perception of Tim Blackman changed, whether his motivations changed, and whether you thought that after all your research you decided that you were going to, draw a character of him from beginning to end that was consistent, or do you think that he changed with the times because the media took him on in such a way that he ultimately became his own celebrity?
Yeah, I agree with you. He is one of the most interesting characters in the book. As for his motivation, I don't think it changed at all. From the beginning until the case was resolved, he was determined to find out what had happened to Lucie, and then to see some kind of justice. I'm interested that you finished the book concluding that he was evil. I mean, I certainly don't see him as evil. In writing this book and in dealing with these characters, I tended, by and large, to hold back from making explicit judgments on their characters and actions, partly because I really don't think it's the place of those of us who have not been through an experience like this to pass judgment on people who have had such horrific loss to deal with. But at one point I do speak in my own voice in a way to defend Tim Blackman, really. He got up a lot of people's noses from the beginning. But the act that was most roundly denounced was his decision to take the money from Obara, the 100 million yen. And it was extraordinary to me to see, especially in the media, the British media, how people, interviewers, television anchors who a few years before had been kind of simpering over him and, "Oh, Mr. Blackman, how terrible you must feel. Tell us how you feel. How does it feel?" We're suddenly behaving like inquisitors. It was as if it was open season on him. He accepted a check. He didn't kill anyone. He never wanted to be in that situation or that position. Now, as far as taking the money goes, we can all imagine ourselves in that terrible, terrible situation, and we can imagine what we might have done if we received a similar offer. But actually none of us know, because we've never been there. In the absence of that certainty, which none of us have, I think the only important question is, did the payment of that money have any effect on the outcome of the case? In both the High Court case and the Appeal Court, the judges in their judgment said explicitly that it didn't. And Obara received the maximum sentence, which he could have done. So I don't know if I'd been in his situation whether I would have taken the money or not, but I am sure that I don't have any right to judge Tim Blackman for that, and nor does anyone else.
But didn't he actually make some statements after it? I mean, accepting the money is one thing. I accept your point that perhaps under the circumstances you might feel you were due some recompense, or I know you had some financial issues as well, but didn't he then actually go to the judge and make some sort of plea for
he kind of did. There was, of course Obara was doing this one infers, because he thought it would help him. So Tim Blackman ended up signing another very bizarre document in strange English, questioning very specific details about some of the physical evidence. Yeah, he signed that, and that was presented in court. He signed that because he wanted the money. He decided he wanted to take the money, and there had to be some kind of quid pro quo, otherwise Obara would not have coughed. I believe that was his reasoning. But that didn't. There's no reason to believe that affected the case.
But Tim wouldn't have known that prior to signing the document, presumably, right? I mean,
well, no one knew what the verdict was going to be because there hadn't been a verdict. But
so I
can't speak for him, but I think he made a judgment that it would be okay, and he was right.
Richard?
Right.
Richard, thank you very much for the lecture. I apologize, I was a bit late in joining. So my question, if it was referred to in the beginning of your talk, I just wanted to refer to the Ichihashi case in the Chiba, the English teacher. If you talked a little bit about that in the beginning, that won't be my question. Oh, you did? Okay, so that'll be the other question, if you hadn't respect to that, was how much do you think this Lucie Blackman story is Japan? I mean, could there have been, maybe a British with a foreign nationality found a Japanese hostess in Soho and killed her, and raped other foreign people, and then hid her in a cave in Dover, and discovered. I mean, pick from those two questions, and you can answer each one.
Yeah, I mean, it's an irony of this book in a way that it's a long, detailed book about a horrible crime in probably the safest large city that has ever existed in the world. I mean, that's a very big statement, but is there any other challenger for that title? I tried to make the point in this book that whatever Giorgio Barra is, he's not a kind of symbol of Japan or a representative of the Japanese male. There were a lot of very tedious, annoying coverage in some of the British tabloids about how weird Japanese men are, and how they love blonde chicks, and they're fascinated with them, and they prey on them. The sources for this information always seem to be blonde chicks working in Roppongi, rather than anyone with a wider perspective. I mean, this is an interesting story, and I hope it articulates broader truths about Japan. But one of those truths is certainly not that Japan is a dangerous place. Yes, I mean, it's a very Japanese story, and there's no equivalent of the Japanese hostess bar that I know of in the West. But girls, who work in entertainment, stroke sex trade, from barmaids to call girls, are certainly at greater risk of crimes of violence and sexual crimes perpetrated by men. You mentioned the Ichihashi case, which I also covered as a reporter. There seemed to be. I had to deal with questions from time to time from editors in London asking, attempting to link the two. Isn't this Ichihashi case just like the Lucie Blackman case? And I mean, all that they have in common is the nationality of the victims, and the fact they were young and fairly attractive. I haven't done this, but if you were to examine the crime statistics for London, New York, Moscow, for the years 2000 to 2007, or whenever the Ichihashi case happened, I wonder how many Japanese women or Korean women or other foreign women you'd find who had been murdered or died in grisly circumstances. Plenty, I think. Yeah. In Japan, is not crime free, but I think it can still be very proud of its low crime rate.
I think you were next.
Hey, Richard. Sorry I didn't make the conference. I was probably drinking with one of the right-wingers that menaced you. We'll have to check with you later to make sure they're not the same guys.
I'm sure you don't go drink with people from Saitama, though,
No. I was in Saitama for 5 years.
Of course,
you know, covering the Saitama Police Department.
I'd forgotten.
It's the New Jersey of Japan, lovely place. You're assigned there. And actually, I don't think I was soft on Tim Blackman in the book. I mean, actually, I think Tim is a kind of a hero. If he hadn't been such a pain in the ass, I don't think the police would have moved on the case. And as a result of the Lucie Blackman case and all the negative attention it received, Japan toughened its rape laws so that it went from a 2-year penalty to 3 years. Though if you pay a fine and compensation of the victim, you can still walk away without doing any jail time, get a suspended sentence, but that's Japan. Really, a softball question. Is the book coming out in Japanese? And if so, who's going to publish it?
There's no Japanese publisher yet, but very, very able and dedicated people are working on that as we speak.
But is there any similar title book, written by Japanese?
Similar title? Oh, there is.
Similar title, close the title, and then the story is very, very similar.
There's this needs to be pointed out. There is a book, a Japanese book about aspects of the case called Yami-ogu Hitobito, which means people who eat darkness. And I came across that while I was doing the research and thought it was a great title. I think it sounds even better in English than it does in Japanese, actually. But unfortunately, it wasn't my title. But on the off chance, I went to see the journalist who'd written that, Mr. Matsugaki, and asked him if he'd mind if I translated his title into English and used it for my book, and he very graciously encouraged me to do so. So is that what you mean? There is, yeah. It's a completely different book. So if this book is eventually translated into Japanese, then we need a new title. Are you next?
Yes, thank you. My question is quite simple and stems back on from the question we had immediately before Jake's, and your observations that you do feel the story reveals some universal or broader truths about Japan and Japanese culture, particularly the hostess culture and the police and judicial system. So I'm interested in your views on what, if anything, you think Lucie's story might have changed 11 years on.
Yeah, that's a good question. In some ways, not much. Roppongi's changed since 2000, but I think it was probably going to change anyway. When I was researching this book, I wanted to talk to hostesses, for professional reasons, to find out about, to get into their mind, and to find out about how they lived, and etc. And I embarked on this in, I guess it was 2005, 2006, around then. I took some time off work. And if you want to talk to hostesses, there are two ways you can do it. You can either pay them 12,000 yen an hour to sit opposite you, and I did that for a couple of hours, but it just got too expensive. So I thought, well, I'll try and get a job in a hostess bar, young, debonair, good-looking guy like me, I have no problem. It was quite difficult to find a job. One of the reasons was that, well, one reason is that I'm not as good-looking as I thought, and the other is that by that stage there were fewer hostess bars like the one Lucie worked in. The one she worked in is still going, actually, amazingly. But there aren't many others. There used to be about half a dozen, where basically, middle class, British, Australian, New Zealand, not many American, but some Canadian girls. For some reason, they tend to be from Commonwealth countries more. Europe, Scandinavia, Israel would go and work, and there'd be people like Lucie. There weren't many left when I started looking for a job. I think partly because of her story. I mean, if you were a 21-year-old wanted to go on an adventure, then you'd find it even harder now to convince your mum that hostessing in Japan was a good idea. But I think it's also because it's got harder. The immigration authorities have clamped down. Ishihara had a bit of a clamp down on Roppongi. They tend to check visas a lot more carefully. So tragically, the only place I could find myself a job was in a very seedy pole dancing bar on the main strip, where I lasted 3 nights. Partly because they weren't the kind of hostesses I was most interested in. I was interested in the ones who kept their clothes on most of the time. And also because I was a terrible barman, and it really is hard being a barman. I don't know if you've ever tried it. Does that answer your question? I can't remember.
I think what I was wondering is, do you think a young foreign hostess like Lucie walking into Roppongi police station today with a similar story to tell would be taken more seriously?
Yes, I think they would be taken more seriously. Of course, your question was about what's changed, and I think that has changed. This is just a hunch, but the Lindsay Hawker case, I think, reflected that change. I mean, that was a different case in many ways, but Lindsay Hawker was an English teacher. She went missing, and her friend and her employer reported her missing. She'd gone out to meet a man to give him an English lesson. Now, in different ways, the police didn't cover themselves in glory on that case either. But one thing they did do was react very fast once they got the report. They were round at that guy's place in a few hours. It's impossible to know. I could be wrong about this, but I think probably part of the reason they moved so quickly was because the memory of this case. And I think, senior detectives around the country now understand that where there's a foreigner involved, at least a foreigner from a rich, affluent Western country with a big embassy in Tokyo, when there's one of those kind of foreigners involved, then the consequences of screwing up are quite bad, and you want to look good early on. Now, it's a sad fact, as Jake knows and could tell us about, that citizens of poorer, less diplomatically powerful countries, especially in East Asia, can get into bother and not command the same attention. But that is one change that's happened.
I was actually going to ask you about the experience you gained during your work experience, but you've covered that already. What I was going to ask as well is what technical aspects of writing this book can you tell us about? The research, was it all done by you, or do you have teams of researchers? And how long did it take, if you can quantify, in researching and writing the book?
Yes, well, I was reporting this as a newspaper reporter as soon as it became known in July 2000. So for the first 5 or 6 years, I followed the case as a foreign correspondent. And then I decided to do a book and was commissioned by a publisher. And I took some time off work. I mean, overall, I took, I suppose, 10 months off work, spread out over a few years. And I spent too much on research and then didn't have enough time for the writing, which is always the way. I did employ Japanese researchers, mainly because my own Japanese language is still so rubbish, unfortunately. And they helped me with interviews and also with the court case. Most of the hearings, I had someone there following and taking very good notes, which it was very useful when I came to write the book. Does that answer your question?
Pretty much, yes. And in terms of inspiration, what kind of style did you adopt in writing this? Is it something that you your own personal style, or were there any previous writers that you drew upon?
Yeah, I mean, there's some of the reviewers who wrote about this book when it came out in Britain, put it in its context in a way. I mean, there is of course a history of I suppose ambitious non-fiction crime writing. The one everyone points to is Truman Capote, in Cold Blood. Norman Mailer, of course. Gordon Byrne was a British writer who wrote about British serial killers in a non-lurid way. I mean there are. I realised, and I hadn't fully appreciated this before, that there's a lot of kind of generic snobbery about what's referred to as true crime. I mean, this book falls into a true crime category. It's about a true crime. But a lot of true crime writing is regarded by high-minded, educated literary types as being a bit grubby and below their consideration. And a couple of the reviewers actually said, normally I'd never read a true crime book, but actually this one is all right. So I did read those writers. I wasn't directly emulating them. I mean, I read a lot of non-fiction, from George Orwell, V.S. Naipaul, Ryszard Kapuscinski, all kinds, and I think all of that probably filtered in somehow, as well as fiction. I mean, books like this. I try to write this not simply in the form of a 400-page memo, but to use devices like suspense, dialogue, close characterization, and also the trick of withholding information, which you have, and delivering it in sequenced doses to keep the reader hooked.
Richard, first of all, the book was fabulous. I really enjoyed it. My question: since the book has come out, have there been any contacts from any of the players, including Elvira, or anything that would be another side of the story?
No, I'm very glad to say there haven't been any more official letters from Obara or his lawyers. Of course, we prepared for that. I mean, he sued me once, and he might sue me again. And after I'd finished writing this book, I spent literally months going backwards and forwards with lawyers commissioned by the publisher in London as well as Japan, going over every word and making sure that it was Obara proof, which it is. So I'm glad to say I haven't heard from him. No, he's in jail now. I mean, until last December, when his final appeal failed, he was technically an innocent man awaiting his final verdict. But when that was his appeal was thrown out, he became a convicted criminal, and he's in Chiba prison now, where he has much less access to lawyers and documents and fewer privileges, which would enable him to pursue civil actions. Although he is still pursuing several civil actions against a number of people, though not me. Fingers crossed.
I have a question. Hi, my name is Stephanie. I'm a student here at TUJ. Just after thinking about everything that we talked about, or that you have told us about, I was kind of curious as to what was, how was the public's reaction in Britain to this story of her death, or more than likely murder, by this Obara-san. And also, I was wondering if there was any kind of affiliation between the British government into this particular case. I mean, I don't know much about how Japanese government and British government have ties with or anything like that. I'm just kind of curious as to what was the UK's reaction to this, and if maybe the British Embassy or anybody had contact with this.
That's an interesting part of the story, and it goes back, I think, to what we were saying about Tim Blackman's role in this. Tim Blackman came out quite early on and was very vigorous in his engagement with the media, to the extent that some were suspicious and critical of him for that. But as he explained it to me, he had a very clear strategy. I mean, he was talking to journalists not, he said, because he especially loved doing it, but because that was the way he could keep the case of his missing daughter in the news, in the public eye, and thereby put pressure on people who might have a chance of finding her. And the other thing it did was his presence and his the way he guided that story influenced the media coverage in Britain. Early on, it could have gone two ways. That the British tabloid press came out in numbers to cover the story after she'd gone missing, and it might easily have been presented as a rather seedy story, a story essentially of a vice girl, a girl who was doing something disreputable, nasty, sex work of some kind, who got out of her depth and ended up dead. And that would have been a lurid story which would have lasted 1 week. But because Tim Blackman was there and his other daughter, Lucie's sister Sophie, they were able to present it as a different kind of story, equally appealing to these tabloid newspapers, about a family, a tragic family, whose beloved, lovely daughter had gone missing in a strange place, and who were desperately trying to find her. Now that's a very different story, and that is a story that can run and run. And it did. And because it ran around, it kept up the pressure, as Tim Blackman had hoped. And one thing that he was, in some ways, very fortunate with was that the summer of 2000, the Japanese government was hosting the G8 summit in Okinawa. And on the way to Okinawa, the heads of government stopped in Tokyo, of course, and Tony Blair passed through and stopped in Tokyo. And the newspapers at the time were full of this story about this nice family and their tragically missing daughter. And Tim Blackman asked to see Tony Blair. In those circumstances, Tony Blair could not afford not to see Tim Blackman. Tony Blair was then at the height of his popularity. It's hard to remember now. But he was. And part of his appeal was that he was seen as being a very empathetic family man, a listener, an empathetic person. And so they sat down together, they had a meeting, and there's a photograph which is in this book of Tony Blair sitting there with his sensitive expression on his face as the father and the sister of this missing girl talk. So Tim Glatman said to him, well, can you help? And he said, well, look, I'll try. I can mention it to the Japanese Prime Minister, who I'm seeing this afternoon. The Japanese Prime Minister must have been a bit surprised when this was brought up among talk of, global warming, nuclear disarmament and the rest. But it was mentioned, and the British Prime Minister asked the Japanese Prime Minister if he could help. Now, I don't know exactly what happened next, but I'm very sure that the Japanese Prime Minister contacted his Justice Minister, the Justice Minister contacted the Tokyo Metropolitan Police, and the detectives on the case realised very clearly that this was an important case that they had to solve. So the British government's involvement went only that far. They didn't make any demands, they weren't in a position to. But it was raised at the very highest level. And again, I can't be sure, but I believe that had quite an influence on the police.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. Let me ask you about your comment on the Japanese press. This Lucie Blackman's case was very well known among the Japanese press, that the British press came to Japan and tried to attend the press conference of the local police station, but they were rejected or refused to attend. And ever since, Japanese Kisha Club system was heavily criticized by the British press and other foreign press. And it was really the beginning of the whole story of improvement of the situation. And I wonder if you are satisfied with the consequence of the changing the Kisha Club system. I wonder if you see it more open than before. And other one is that while you were researching and writing this wonderful book, how much helpful the Japanese press reporting was. Were you satisfied with the way Japanese press reported this whole case of Lucie Blackman and Elvira? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. They're two interesting questions. Yeah, I mean, since 2000, certainly as far as I'm concerned, I think it has got easier for foreign correspondents to work here and to work around the Kisha Club system. Back then it was we really got very little from the police. I remember there was a man called Inspector Mi at the Roppongi, the Azabu police station, Roppongi, and he was the man who was designated as the Madoguchi for the press. The window. He was brilliant at talking to you for a long time and telling you absolutely nothing with the greatest charm and affability. In other areas, the foreign ministry is very open now. The Ministry of Finance, Trade, even the Defence Ministry, which is quite conservative. It's much easier now for us to get access. The Kisha Club system is still there, and speaking personally, I've got nothing against it. If Japanese reporters want to form clubs, that's fine, as long as they don't exclude the rest of us. And we are much less excluded than we once were. The two staunch holdouts, the two Japanese government agencies that are still very difficult to crack and still very close now are the Imperial Household Agency and the police. And the contact I had with detectives involved in the case was really took a long time, and they were retired officers who had finished their jobs and I think as a result felt a bit less constrained. And your second question was about the Japanese press coverage. Yeah, I mean it was different in tone, of course. It always is. I don't think any journalists who are reporting the case as it unfolded, and I include myself, really covered themselves in glory. There were no huge scoops to be had. We just didn't know what had happened until the police found the man. We were all struggling. So, the Japanese coverage was more reticent in a way, and in some ways more starchy. The foreign coverage was livelier and more irresponsible in some cases, but that's always the way it goes.
Okay, I think we're going to have to cut it at that. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for